Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Um, it is the second session of Windy City Warmth's Doubled Up Conference. And today we'll be talking about, or this morning we'll be talking about the work of NGOs in housing. So we have a fantastic lineup for this morning. This is I'm very honored that we have such wonderful speakers. So we'll have first speaking is Dr. Jonas. She is an administrator with Chicago Public Schools who works primarily with impoverished students. And then we also have Brianne Spresser, who's the Homeless Services Program Manager at Lincoln Park Community Services. And then we'll be hearing from Dr. Huggett, who is a healthcare practitioner with Lawndale Christian Health Center, who at the beginning of the pandemic converted a hotel into a shelter for people experiencing homelessness. And then finally, we'll be having Lauren Cole speak. She's the Associate Director of Housing for Breakthrough Urban Ministries, where she's been working there for over 12 years. So we have a lot of experience here with us today, a lot of wonderful people. And I would just like to remind you all that if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. The first half of the session today will be the speakers giving about 10-minute talks, and then after that, we'll have a Q&A portion for all of you to ask questions and to pick their brains a little bit. So with that being said, thank you everyone for making the time. Dr. Jonas, please feel free to take it away. Oh, you're muted.
Thank you so much, James. I'm going to share my screen and I will go ahead and say how much this is such an important topic, um, how much I just really feel like, especially during the times of COVID, that we really were dealing with something that was an issue on top of an issue, right? So in the same way that for our personal family that we struggled with COVID, but then George Floyd happened, and then after that, we really had other issues that came up societally. Students who are struggling with homelessness, they already we're dealing with, income problems, school instability, instability, but then they had COVID, and I think, like all of us, we're just dealing with multiple layers of things. So just really glad to be speaking today and sharing about this really important topic. um, there we go. um, let's go ahead. um, Okay, so here we go. Obviously, the doubled up notion is actually a CPS term that I'm pretty familiar with. I'm the assistant principal and CPS STLS coordinator. Just that's one of my kind of subtopic responsibilities, in terms of like student discipline, being one of the assistant principals or a dean, or just different academic aspects. We do have kind of division of labor where I'm the Student in Temporary Living Situation STLS coordinator for my school. We have about 8 families that are identified with STLS, because some of our families who are quote unquote doubled up are actually also families that are immigrant families where it's part of their culture or part of something that they're intentionally doing. But then other families that are, quote unquote doubled up, they actually are not wanting to live that way, not intentionally living that way. in a sort of communal, intentional way. So I think that this topic and this subtopic of doubling up is actually a term that I just got familiar with because of this role at the school. But I'm really grateful to be here, and we'll be sharing both about CPS and also a little bit about PADS if I have time to share about that as well. Obviously, I'm Sunny Sucheng Jonas. I know James through Wheaton College because that's his alma mater. My husband teaches there, and one of his colleagues, Dr. Tolley, who does urban studies, department chair position, introduced us, and here I am. I'll talk a little bit about CPS and PADS, and then I'll talk a little bit about a four-pronged leadership model and multi-tiered mentoring, which is kind of a structure that I feel like is really important for our students and for homelessness. In terms of my own experiences, I've had experiences mostly in what are called P20 settings. It used to be called K-12, kindergarten through 12th grade, but now they're extending that kind of in federal government terminology to include preschool through 20th grade, not just kindergarten through 12th, but preschool all the way to the transition of kindergarten through all the way through the transition of 5th to 6th grade, 6th through 8th grade, 8th to 9th grade, 12th through 13th grade, which is college, 17th to 18th grade, which is grad school, etc. So all the way through 20th grade, they're saying that whether it's an issue like housing insecurity and homelessness, or whether it's college retention, all those issues can be tracked along that, what's called the P20 continuum. So some of the ways that I've served in different schools and different settings, which really matters in terms of the exposure that I've had with kids in poverty and kids with housing insecurity. It's been the first picture is from Afghanistan, where I helped with a school that was founded by an organization called Frontiers, which was like which is a Muslim Christian partnership in terms of supporting schools and schools over in Afghanistan. I also served in New Haven, which was a 90% poverty school, 90% free and reduced lunch, but also 95% African American school that I got to do my principal internship in. I served in Kenya, which is that third picture with House of Hope. Served in Catlin Gable in Portland, Oregon, where I did my teaching internship. Kosminski was my first CPS school as an undergraduate, as a TA, teacher's assistant, which was right on the south side of Chicago where I was going to college. And then most recently, before my CPS reentry, I served with World Relief, which is a nonprofit where I serve refugee youth. And that picture is of a 4-H embryology and Lego robotics club that I wrote a grant for middle school Burmese and Bhutanese girls. So obviously in terms of homelessness, high poverty schools also have a high proportion of homelessness, but it's also cultural, where there all are issues of multiple family housing, where there's also issues of like cultural shame with taking federal supports and housing supports, Section 8 housing. So all those cultural supports and cultural values and kind of the milieu that people are operating in really are affected in terms of dealing with that bridge between communities of poverty and communities of homelessness. Obviously, I'm going to talk a little bit about CPS and my role as a STLS coordinator, but I will touch hopefully a little bit on PADS, another nonprofit, and some leadership models. I did some social work. I was a classroom teacher, did the refugee youth resettlement education, and then I've been doing MTSS and administration, whether it was a principal, an assistant principal, or director position, now in 3 states, in Illinois, Oregon, and Connecticut. If in a different format, I would have some of you share your name and work, student status, and interest in this topic. And I hope to hear some of those things someday. Okay, so I hope that by the end of this short time together that we'll be able to learn about CPS and PADS as organizations and the ways that they support housing insecurity and homeless. I hope that we'll be able to apply leadership models for personal application and also kind of not just the micro application, but like macro application regarding housing insecurity and homelessness. In terms of links that can be shared, there are two huge links that I feel like are really helpful in terms of CPS supports. Even if you just Googled CPS, STLS, some of these links could come up, but in particular, there's kind of crisis supports and then there are kind of ongoing programmatic supports. So there's things like offering backpacks, um, and food and temporary shelter, but there's also things of crisis, like if there's mental health supports, if somebody needs to get rushed to rush hospital, things like that. So there's kind of those acute supports for these families, but there's also kind of long-term supports. That's some of the structures that CPS offers, and some of those links are the websites that talk a little bit more about that. This is one of those websites. It talks about specifically the eligibility, how to enroll. But the main thing is that when you talk to a social worker at the school or you talk to a staff person, there's something called mandated reporting that is about abuse and other contexts. But there's also kind of this reporting process where there's a referral that's made to CPS Central, where there's a label and there's kind of resources that are kind of designated to that category of student. And like I said, that can include counseling, acute care, coats, backpacks, meals, etc. In terms of identification, everything is confidential. The designation as STLS, despite the fact that it's a little bit ambiguous and hard to understand unless it's explained as students living in temporary living situations, it's intended to lessen stigma, and it's also intended so that that category feels a little bit more fluid than kind of the binary of homelessness, non-homeless. It's considered they're temporary, it's fluid, it's going to happen to certain students who need that support, but they can move in and out of that category. In terms of the extended families with multiple family members living in one household or multiple nuclear families living, I think, again, like I had mentioned, that that is also contingent on cultural context. That's why kind of these labels are tricky, and not just the quantitative data of like, are they or aren't they? How many are at your school? Like I said, 8 families, but also how is that conversation that I've had with a family something that if they're comfortable receiving services or not comfortable receiving services, if they want backpacks but they don't want Section 8 housing, how are those things like very important nuances that we kind of flesh out within that STLS fluid designation. Stats and facts, 355, over 355,000 students were enrolled last year, and over 600 schools are there. But in terms of Title I poverty and Title III English language learners, Title IX special education percentages, less than 10% are STLS. So that percentage is of course fluid, and it varies from year to year, but that's that kind of designation that happens from the referral process. Sorry, so obviously the disaggregation of data for these 3 categories happens because those 3 categories kind of overlap. And in terms of a Venn diagram, there's a 3 kind of fold federal designation of Title III, Title I, Title IX categories of students, and they overlap, they really do. So if you have a triple exceptional student who is special ed and also impoverished and also EL versus a single exceptional student who is only impoverished but is a primary language learner and is not special ed. Those kind of resources and the resource management and the overlap of those resources matters not only for federal designation of monies, but also for the ways that we're supporting the students relationally, holistically, and also programmatically in the schools. Okay, migrant education. I wanted to talk about that because I did get my doctorate in bilingual because I care a lot about the notion of English learners and the ways that they're actually starting to be considered assets instead of deficits in terms of knowing two languages. Migrant education and the ways that Illinois State Board of Education deals with housing insecurity is a kind of STLS student is considered sometimes homeless because of their living situation being temporary and not desired, whatever it is. But it's again one of those overlapping categories where if their parent moves up and down the West Coast from Oregon and Washington to California, picking crops, then obviously the migrant education programs are one of those resources where STLS students and migrant education students are being doubly resourced and doubly supported. So if I could talk a little bit about PADS, I think I have 1 minute left. I'm going to talk a little bit about the fact that a nonprofit organization, which today's Saturday seminars talks about nonprofits. So even though CPS is technically a public school nonprofit, kind of considered kind of an NGO, PADS is another kind of partner organization where they have interim overnight housing that switches from different community centers and churches and career services and support services and partnerships. Um, they have um, they have kind of what I really do think fits into like a leadership model of inspirational, relational, positional, and functional leadership where you're kind of on set caring for the homeless vets or the single moms or like whatever category of homelessness really caused the catalyst of the homelessness, and really trying to deal with the onset, but also developing and maturing the leadership so that there's a phasing out of the homelessness designation through the supports. And in terms of continued resources, Homelessness in America, there's an amazing 10-minute review focusing on possibilities, especially post-COVID for homelessness. The Illinois Council of Homelessness is amazing. It really does partner with Illinois State Board of Education and CPS in particular in dealing with homelessness, not only for adults, but also for youth. Um, and then sorry, yeah, so then those two resources are great places where you can learn more about homelessness outside of PADS and CPS. And then there'll be a great Q&A time at the end. So looking forward to that, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Jonas. Brianne Sprasser, please feel free to take it away.
All right. Oh, I need to
Oh, you're muted still.
Here we go. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Brianne Spresser. I work for Lincoln Park Community Services, which is a comprehensive social service agency on the north side in Chicago. We originally started out in the Lincoln Park neighborhood, and then we have a newer facility that we've been at for almost 2 years now, in Old Town, kind of just on the border of Old Town and Lincoln Park. And the history of the shelter really came about 35 years ago. There were folks who were unstably housed or had no housing at the time, who were kind of like sleeping outside the church, or kind of in like the alleyway or gangway between like church buildings. And there are 4 churches that are in really close proximity in Lincoln Park, within just like a couple of blocks, and they joined together to rotate opening up just like the sanctuary of the church, for people to sleep in overnight, and things just developed from there. It really, I mean, isn't that a true kind of meaning of sanctuary? And a true like community effort to really assist people who are unstably housed. So we have several programs kind of on like the whole continuum of housing. We work with people who are street-based, people who are doubled up. We have an interim housing shelter program. We also do aftercare. We call that our graduate program. And then we also have supportive housing. So I'll start with what we call our community engagement program, which is for people who are housing insecure, who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. We have for many, many years done a drop-in program on the weekend on Sundays. We use a space at a church. Folks can come in, it's like pretty low barrier. People can come in for a meal. We have showers available, laundry available, just like meeting very basic needs. But we've really developed relationships with people over the years who access these services, and intentionally kind of added more case management services to get to know people who are coming and to offer further services if people wanted help gaining housing or any other number of things. Sometimes people don't have an ID and we help with that. And so we do come across a lot of people who are doubled up, and it can be really difficult sometimes. A lot of what we do is as far as like helping people gain subsidized housing. You can, if you're low income, you can still qualify for subsidized housing, but there are also housing programs that are specifically for people experiencing homelessness. And these programs, you have to meet the HUD definition of literal homelessness. And unfortunately, being doubled up does not meet that definition. And I'm kicking myself for not joining in last night and listening. So I'm sure that probably was touched on. What we've really seen over the years with our community engagement program is just so true to across the board working with people, is that building relationships is one of the most important things, building trust with people. A few years ago, I worked on expanding our program through a relationship with another church in the neighborhood that was doing drop-in meals. They have a meal service a few days a week. And we noticed that there's a lot of crossover with people accessing services and a lot of folks who uniquely only went to one or the other. Something that happened is that people got to know me and my staff more, and it gained trust in like asking for services or engaging in services toward more housing stability. Like specifically within that first year, we had two people who we'd known for a really long time who would come for our drop-in and kind of was like, no, I just want a meal and a shower. And but we still kind of got to know them, and then seeing them like two or three times a week really changed that relationship. And we were able to, grow in some depth, and eventually both of these guys access the shelter and also, access assistance for gaining some permanent housing. And it did result in these folks having permanent housing. So, I mean, I think just, especially with the continuum of care of like healthcare and housing, our relationships with each other, with other agencies, with other providers are extremely important to make sure that people really get everything that they need, needs met. So another core program of ours is our interim housing program. We serve adults, single adults. We can accommodate couples, but the setup are a large room, which we call a dorm, and it is separated by the gender binary. So it is self-identified gender. So we do receive funding from the Department of Family and Supportive Services. So people generally have to be referred from the city to access the shelter. It's pretty easy by calling 311. And anybody who is 18 and over is eligible. So in the interim housing, once you've come to the shelter, you have your bed reserved, and people have a locker or a dresser to store their things, and the building's open 24 hours, and people engage in intensive case management. Um, when we expanded in 2019, we opened this new building, and so it has a separate floor for men and for women, and so we added beds, but the total addition of number of beds wasn't all that great when we were moving from our old location in the building in the basement of a church to this new one, and we were able to secure funding to retain our old location. So now we have 2 interim housing shelters. And then, of course, shelters were really affected by COVID, and the congregate living is such a risk. And what we had to do initially, with of course, having masks on site, having everyone wear masks, but to have the social distancing, we had to separate like bunk beds and spread things out. And so as people moved out, we couldn't fill some of the spaces. So then it reduced access to shelter. In a time when people were losing jobs and more people becoming homeless. It was really difficult. So we did that at both sites. And then what was really helpful, you'll learn about from Dr. Huggett, the program that he ran, that was really helpful to some of the clients that we worked with. We ended up, after some time, because churches were generally closed, people weren't coming in the buildings. Our site on Fullerton, that's in the basement of a church, since no one was coming for services, we ended up, the church really partnered with us and with the city to add more shelter beds in their main floor of the church building. So we were able to, it really started when we had a terrible snowstorm in, was it November? So it was just a several month program, and it looks like we're extending that. A lot of times when people come to the interim housing shelter, they've been doubled up for quite a while. It's really difficult to get housing in the time frame that you need it to secure subsidized housing. Anybody who's searched for a job knows it takes a lot longer than you plan. Even if you get a job right away, by the time you get the interview and your start date, it can take months. And so that's really difficult for families when people are doubled up, or friends, not being prepared or not having the resources to actually have another person in their home. And some people feel a lot of shame too, and so they feel like they're going to put their family out, or by asking for help. And so sometimes it's kind of like at the end of that rope of exhausting those resources that people end up seeking shelter. And so we really work with people to address what their housing needs are, and find appropriate housing. We try to work on a housing first model, which basically just means that everyone's deserving of housing. You don't have to prove that you're ready by doing anything to achieve sobriety or doing classes for employment. Sometimes getting the security of housing and that stability is really what helps of working on those other things. And of course we have to address people's barriers, but we really have to look at things from what people's strengths are too. Experiencing homelessness is really traumatic. So people surviving it are, true survivors and are getting through difficult situations. Um, so, and I'll move on from the shelter program. I'm gonna go back to that. So we rely really heavily on volunteers. Almost all of our meals are donated by volunteers at both of our shelter sites. And so what we used to do, especially for dinners, groups would come on site and use the kitchen and cook and serve dinner. And we had to stop that. There's a huge change in like asking people to continue supporting us. And so what we've been doing for over a year now, volunteers will either order catering from for us and have it delivered, or pizzas, or people will cook a huge meal at home and deliver it. It's been really unique, and we've lost a lot of that feeling of connection with the community. We did a lot of adaptation of having like job coaches and financial literacy coaches. We got a generous donation of iPads so we could do some things virtually. So lots of changes, of course. We've all felt changes from COVID. We also have a supportive housing program, and that is for people who are coming from homelessness. And usually they are required to have experience with what's called chronic homelessness. So people have disabling conditions and have experienced homelessness for a year or more. And what this does, it's scattered sites. We work with individual landlords to find apartments for people, and the program pays the rent. It's through a HUD grant, and if someone has income, they pay 30%, just like you would in any other subsidized program, 30% of their income toward rent. And if they don't, we work toward helping them secure income or improving their situation. And so supportive housing is really helpful for people who need more support to maintain housing, whether it be because of health conditions or anything else. With our new building that opened almost 2 years ago, we also have a 20-unit studio apartment building that's attached to the same building as the shelter. And people get on the wait list for those units through CHA. So that was really exciting to be able to build some permanent housing with that. So that's kind of the whole spectrum of services. We try to help people who are doubled up and end up facing challenges as far as like homeless definitions, but there are always resources that we can help people with. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Brianne. Dr. Huggett, please feel free to take it away.
Thanks, James, for the opportunity. Brianne, I loved your presentation. I'd like to try to share my screen here if I could. Is that viewable?
Yes, it is.
Okay, let me see if I can get this to fix this a little bit. Is that better?
Yes.
So, okay, great. So my name is Tom Huggett. I work as a family doctor at Lawndale Christian Health Center. And I was asked to speak to the topic of housing instability and health in particular. So thanks for the opportunity for this. I work with a great team that has worked in serving folks experiencing homelessness on the west side of Chicago for 25, 30 years. We currently go to 14 different homeless shelter sites. And we work very closely with Breakthrough. Lauren Cole is going to come after me, and it was great to work with Brianne and her team at Lincoln Park during the pandemic. So, so what I'd like to do is just Lawndale Christian Health. Can somebody tell me if that advanced okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Lawndale Christian Health Center is a federally qualified community health center on the west side, and we have 6 clinics serving the west side. In addition, we're serving folks experiencing homelessness. Our mobile health team comprises primary care physicians, family nurse practitioners. We have medical assistants. Some of our team kind of in the back of this. This is in the basement of a church at Walls at 200 South Sacramento on the west side. Of course, this picture is pre-COVID. So you can, it's always a shock. It's always kind of a shocker to see pictures with no masks and people kind of close together. But we provide, this is in the middle of the picture on the left, it shows the suitcase of the medications that we bring with us. So we bring all of the computers and the medications with us to the shelter sites. There are some shelter sites where we actually have an exam room within the shelter, and that's the case at Breakthrough where Lauren is. And we do basic primary care. We were able to give medications if they need it. We do a lot of foot care, urine testing. We also wanted to kind of talk a little bit about healthcare and homelessness. Bobby Watts with National Healthcare for the Homeless Clinicians Network really talked about this last night, but it really shows that folks who are experiencing homelessness really are very vulnerable to early death compared to the general population. He was particularly talking about unsheltered homeless have an almost 10-fold higher mortality rate than the general population. Unsheltered homeless are also have a 3 times fold higher rate of dying than sheltered folks. So we really need to pay attention very closely to folks who are on the streets. Now, related to coronavirus, what we found through this pandemic is that staying in larger shelters increases the risk of coronavirus infection. The picture on the lower left is typical of a very large congregate shelter. This was this was during coronavirus, actually, when there were no barriers in between, no dividers. Now this shelter, which is Franciscan Outreach on Harrison, has dividers, and there are 4 beds in a kind of almost like a little pod. But within this room, there were about 180 men sleeping. What we found through some kind of basic investigation is that if a person was staying in a shared room with more than 20 people, they had a much increased risk of contracting coronavirus. We also know that housing itself can lead to better health. Housing is healthcare. And this is a study that was done in Chicago on the right that was published in JAMA in 2009, which really shows that by getting people into housing, it decreased subsequent hospitalizations by 29%. This is extremely significant. There are more and more studies that are continuing to show that housing really is healthcare, and we really need to continue to help with housing. I'd like to share some information that Lauren is very well aware of, and this kind of demonstrates some of the supports that folks need to achieve housing. This is, it's a large spreadsheet, but it does illustrate quite a few things. What this stems from was we had several what they call AMEs, or accelerated moving events, where teams of people who were involved with housing came to shelters and tried to assist them to move more quickly into housing. This was funded through the CARES Act and was in response to coronavirus, and was really in response to some of the findings that we had that people who were in large congregate shelter sites with lots of people in one room were very vulnerable to coronavirus and actually other infectious diseases as well. So this funding is aiming to try to house 1,250 people over the next year and a half or so. What we did at Pacific Garden Mission, the largest shelter in the Midwest, Franciscan Outreach on Harrison and also Pilsen, and at 200 South Sacramento and at Breakthrough Men's and Women's, is we did some assessments before the accelerated moving event. What you can see is that a significant number, and we did about 100 of these assessments. So it's pretty easy to kind of see what the percentages are. but about 70% needed case management. What that means is that they needed help with their IDs, their social security cards. They may have applied for disability, but needed help with that. A full quarter of them could not walk upstairs. They either had a stroke, they had amputations. We had several people who were blind and could not navigate stairs. So this really affects, what kind of housing a person goes to. Many of the housing navigators themselves, the people who try to find housing, communicate with their clients by email or texting, but almost half of them were not able to email or text. So this is really a consideration. We also found people that needed medication. I saw one person with a blood pressure of 200/100 that needed medicine immediately. 22% had memory of cognitive problems, and a full half had a mental illness. 36% had a serious mental illness, and what that would mean would be a serious mental illness such as schizophrenia, bipolar, or a schizoaffective disorder requiring assistance to get into, to have support for their housing. So you can, and then we also had people with SUD or substance use disorders that also will need continued support to maintain their housing. And the picture on the lower right is one of my patients who experienced homelessness for 5 or 6 or 7 years, sleeping on the floor of that church that I showed you where our team was. And fortunately, we were able to work with him, stabilize his mental illness, and now he has been successfully housed in this studio apartment for the last 6 years, and he's doing great. The reason that he is doing great is that we were able to stabilize him on long-acting injectable antipsychotics. Unfortunately, he suffers from schizophrenia, and by helping people get long-acting injectables, because sometimes that will really help to stabilize them. Of course, another thing that needs stabilization is the opioid use disorder epidemic, really, that's happening within our pandemic, and you can see how much it's affecting us on the west side of Chicago. And even, this is from last September, but we saw in the early part a year ago, there's a 61% increase in ambulance calls and a 55% increase of opioid-related overdose deaths. So overdose deaths really skyrocketed during the coronavirus pandemic. So we, in response to that, Londell and many other folks have really tried to work with having folks be offered medication for their opioid use disorder. We have groups in the upper corner there. We support them with spiritual care if that's something that's going to be helpful to them. We do urine testing in the bottom right and make sure that people have Narcan. And then I think that one thing that's really, really important, especially this weekend, is how racial injustice, trauma, and stress interact with health and the health of our patients experiencing homelessness. The shooting of Adam Toledo on the west side in Little Village it hugely affects not only the community, but our patients, how they function, how they relate to law enforcement, and just their overall stress. I had patients during when Laquan McDonald was shot who they just stopped taking their medications. They did not see the point of taking medications if it seemed like society that or police who were supposed to support and serve and protect them were against them. So we really have to really look at racial injustice, and this is really a tough time with of course, the trial of Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis right now with the killing of George Floyd, and of course, the death of Adam Toledo. So I used this slide in the last presentation, but I really wanted to say this once again, is that we really have to, especially as speaking as a white person, white folks really need to do more in changing the system. So that really is going to be the way that we will move things forward, especially for folks experiencing homelessness. And I would love to speak a little bit more about doubling up, perhaps in the question and answer section. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Huggett. We will now be moving on to Lauren Cole. So please feel free to take it away.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Lauren Cole. I serve as the Director of Housing Programs for Breakthrough Ministries. I am going to try to share my screen. I do have some slides that I just want to share with you guys. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do it, but can you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Great. All right, so just a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Lauren Cole. I have been with Breakthrough Ministries for 12 years now. I started as a case manager in our women's shelter that Dr. Huggett mentioned in his presentation, and now I work as the director of all of our housing programs. So we have a transitional housing program for men and women, which is a 120-day shelter. We also have permanent supportive housing programs for single individuals. And that program is exactly what it sounds like. It's permanent housing for people who have been chronically homeless. And then we have our family program, which is a partnership with the Department of Family and Support Services and the Chicago Housing Authority, where we work with 11 families who were frequent users of the shelter system, and we provide them with supportive services. The Chicago Housing Authority provides them with a Section 8 voucher that takes care of their rent, and we help to make sure that they maintain housing. And so today I was asked to just speak to you a little bit about my experiences with homelessness in Chicago and what it looks like to be doubled up. This is not in presentation mode, but I'm going to leave that like this just for my own technical benefit. So just a little bit about Breakthrough. Our mission is to build connections, develop skills, and open doors of opportunity. Our vision is to, we envision a safe, stable, and engaged Garfield Park where success is the norm and everyone thrives. So Breakthrough is an organization that has been around for over 25 years now. We are in the East Garfield Park community. We started with a cup of coffee. That is our claim to fame. Our founder, our Lois Sutter, opened up by serving coffee to homeless men on the north side. And it grew from there. People started dropping off clothes for the guys, helping the guys get employment, and we just grew. And so today, we, aside from our housing programs, we also have youth services, we have a violence prevention team, we have a fresh market. And so we are really taking a holistic approach to serving our community. So homelessness. HUD defines homelessness as individuals or families living in a dwelling or a place not meant for human habitation. So when you think about this, you would think about parks, abandoned buildings. In Chicago, we have the tent communities. And so this is what homelessness looks like, according to HUD. We know homelessness to be something a little bit different, which is what this conference is all about. And so when you think about homelessness in the city, you think about people who are also living with family and friends, people who can't afford to pay rent, so they may get a room for a couple of days in a hotel. But this is still homelessness. However, it prevents people from being able to access services in the city for low-income housing. And so Breakthrough, the way that we step in there, the Breakthrough response is transitional housing for men and women. So that is our shelter program, which is the 120-day shelter. In that program, the men and women are matched with a case manager. And during their time there, they work with the case manager to set and achieve their goals. And so this program is housing first. We are very intentional about working with people who may have substance use disorders, who may suffer from mental illness. You do not have to be clean and sober to be in our program. You do not have to be connected to mental health services. So we want to bring you in off the streets. We believe that if we bring people in off the streets and offer them some stability, it makes it easier to attack the other barriers that may be preventing them from moving forward to their goal accomplishments. And so when they come into this program, They have a bed for 120 days. They do not have to leave every day. We offer 3 meals a day. As Dr. Huggett mentioned, we have Lawndale doctors who come on site to service our men and women. And then we also help them with employment. We have an employment coordinator who meets with all of our guests and determines if they're employment ready. If they're not, we have classes that they can take. We connect people to schooling opportunities if they need to get their GED or high school equivalency. And so the program is really designed to meet the participant where they are and walk with them along a continuum in order to set and achieve goals and hopefully move them into more permanent and stable housing. Our permanent supportive housing program is for single individuals. Again, this program works much like our shelter program. However, these are individuals who get an apartment, have keys. They are able to, come and go into their apartment as they please, but they are still matched with case management services. And so the individuals in this program generally have been chronically homeless, which means that they've been homeless for 1 year or more, and they present with a disability. This could be physical, mental, or a substance use disorder. They are also matched with a case manager. That case manager, again, works with them to set and achieve goals. However, we're working with them on a much longer basis because it's permanent housing. And then the FUSE program is the partnership that I was speaking about with the Department of Family and Support Services and the Chicago Housing Authority. So we wanted to offer family services. So the way that we got into this, and this directly speaks to this doubled up situation. A few years ago, Breakthrough saw a lot of people coming to our shelter looking for help. The difference with this group was that they were women with their children, sometimes even multi-generational families. So you may have a grandmother, a daughter, and the daughter's children all coming looking for housing. Unfortunately, we were not able to house them because our shelter is for single men and single women. The number of people that we saw was so great that it really made us say, what can we do? How can we affect change with this population of people? And so we began to think about different ways that we could work with families. And then we were approached by DFSS for this partnership. And so this was our first step in the direction of helping families. And so for the past 4 years, we've been in partnership with DFS and CHA. We've been providing supportive services to 11 families who were identified as families that have been frequent users in the shelter system, but were stable enough that with the right supports, they would be able to maintain their housing. And so we've been providing supportive services to those families. And I am happy to say that 100% of those families have remained housed, have remained stable. Their children are doing well in school. They were working. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, a lot of the mothers had to make a hard decision to stay home because they have small children that they have to do e-learning with. So as we've been doing this, we decided that we wanted to do more because we still see that a lot of families are not able to access low income affordable housing in the city of Chicago because they don't fit that definition of homelessness. They aren't living on the streets. They don't have their own homes, but they're living with families. They're living with friends. And sometimes those families say, hey, you can't stay here any longer. So we wanted to do something to help that group of people that we felt was missing the opportunities. So Breakthrough is currently working to create family housing with a 14-unit new construction building where we'll be offering families transitional housing. So this will be a 2-year program where they will come in, they will work with a case manager, they will work to get employment to save money so that they can move on to more permanent and stable housing. And so those are the ways that Breakthrough response to the homelessness in Chicago, the ways that we want to affect change in our city. So that is it for me. I just wanted to give a quick little overview of who Breakthrough is, what we do, and how we move through homelessness in our city. So thank you, James.
Thank you so much, Lauren. I really appreciate that. And thank you for all the speakers for sharing those talks. Everyone can now unmute and turn your videos on. We will be transitioning to the Q&A portion and the panel discussion. So the first question is, what has been the effect of COVID-19 on people who were already housing insecure? Also, for the audience, please feel free to toss in any questions that you might have throughout this whole time.
Well, I could start briefly. This is Tom Huggett. I think it was really a rough time for people who are experiencing homelessness when Governor Pritzker said, March 15th last year, everybody stay at home. And folks experiencing homelessness, they didn't have a home in which to stay. Furthermore, the libraries closed, a lot of the businesses closed, McDonald's closed, there were just no places really even just to hang out. And so that really, forced a lot of change in the shelter system. Many of them went 24/7. But also even healthcare changed, being a family doc and taking care of folks with substance use disorder and severe mental illness. It really affected our patients. I know our groups had to be suspended, so we kind of had support groups or recovery groups that were suspended. And that's a big social support and a support in recovery. And I'm pretty sure that the reason that one of my patients died of an overdose was because those recovery groups were not there for his support. So it greatly affected our patients. Fortunately, our recovery groups have come back online and everything, and our clinics are pretty much online. My clinic that I see patients at for primary care is not. I'm still seeing patients face to face at the shelters, but it really was very, very tough on it was tough on everybody who was housed, and it was even more tough on folks who were not housed. But those are maybe some examples of how I noticed it was affecting our patients.
I can jump in. Also, I think too. A lot of the shelters had to consider what it looks like to social distance, what it would look like to be able to serve people safely. And that meant that our daytime support center numbers had to be lowered. So we can't have as many people in the building at one time. I know for Breakthrough, we were seeing in our men's center during the day, we would easily see 60 men a day, just coming during the day for food, for showers, to access technology and things like that. But because of the size of our space, we had to cut that down by over 50% so that we could safely social distance with people. And so that meant that the rest of those guys who would normally be there couldn't come. They couldn't come to see the doctor if they needed to, because if they weren't there right in the beginning to get in, unfortunately, we had to turn people away. And so, and it also, even with our overnight shelter, the way that our dormitory style is set up, we had to consider how we could space people out. What would that look like? And so we've not been able to serve the same amount of people that we would normally serve because of COVID.
For kind of the educator point of view, I think what's been really interesting is not only technology access, but also issues have come up that we never would have anticipated. Things like if someone is housing insecure and they're now required to show on their screen their home background. Lauren and I's backgrounds are pretty ambiguous. There's like a purple background for her, there's a green background for her, but you wouldn't ever guess that I was homeless just from my background. Whereas I think some of the situations where, because we had to make exceptions for those 8 families for the screen sharing, those were the only 8 families in our school that were allowed to not screen share. All the other students were forced to and required to, and that was a really controversial piece. Some school administrators did not make exceptions for the STLS students, and that got some flack. But I think that that was a school by school decision. That was not a CPS central decision. And that was just something that we didn't anticipate. So the other piece was the technology and the fact that because online learning was required, not just the STLS students, but all 87% of our Title I poverty students were given technology, but that was a logistical nightmare. You know, between our Chromebooks and our iPads and the chargers that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't work, and all those pass outs and things like that, and tracking, and the fact that, you know, we probably will not get back each of those items. I think that that was some of the pieces that we still have to consider it a privilege to serve those students, even though they require more resources, right? And I think that in the same way that Dr. Huggett talked about medical things and the complications of that, and the way that Laura.
Oh, Dr. Jonas, you're muted.
Resource management, I think that that's really very important, that we acknowledge that no one anticipated all the details of COVID. No type A person, no loving, compassionate, detail-oriented person was able to anticipate all those. So, and I think that we should also be humble enough to say that even after a year, there were people that fell through the cracks. There are students whose academics did not grow. There were students who had seizure disorders who were not able to progress because one of their IEP items said limit screen time. There were so many details that we couldn't have anticipated. And the people that struggled the most were those kind of triple exceptional people who are homeless and poor and English language learners, and like all those different categories. And I think that a place like, you know, Windy City Warmth, or like a context like this, I think that we still have hearts to give those extra resources. But I think we're also seeing during COVID times that there's a stinginess that can sometimes emerge from times of crisis, where like people are protective of their own people, or people are protective of people that are not categorically in categories of need, or, you know, whether it's race, class, whatever. But I do think that it's been shocking to me as a pretty deep humanist that there have been times where I'm like, wow, there is a limitation of resources. And instead of people being generous at the core, sometimes I've seen the limitations of people's generosity and the limitations of people's ability and willingness to share resources.
That's really good. Thank you. For the sake of time, I'm going to move on to the next question. So this comes from one of our audience members. Just to clarify, did you say that Chicago Public Schools has housing choice vouchers that they can offer to students in the STLS program? Does Breakthrough also offer housing choice vouchers? If so, how do these vouchers get distributed among organizations?
So for Breakthrough, no, we do not have housing choice vouchers. The program that we are partnered through DFSS and CHA, we were partnered with 11 families, and those families were giving vouchers. So we weren't giving extra vouchers in order to connect people with housing. Unfortunately, I wish we were. I would love to be able to get more people connected. But with our program, it's just those 11 families who already have the voucher. And with them, their voucher belongs to them and not to our program. So if they decide to leave our program, they could still keep their voucher and move that housing around as they see fit.
And then for CPS, speaking on behalf of over 600 schools, there's still a lot in the STLS program that's school by school. I know that I personally was not able to distribute those. There are situations where, in terms of our partnerships with Chicago Housing and Chicago, the city, HUD, and other contexts of partnerships, I think that what's amazing is that if there's a social worker that's been at the school and she's been the STLS coordinator for like 20 years, she's actually going to speak to that better than I have for 6 years. And I think that's like any job, right? But I do think that in terms of the formal partnership and the formal distribution, I did not distribute any these last 6 years, and I did not distribute any during COVID in terms of housing insecurity and partnerships with particular Section 8 housing too. I think that that's something that I've partnered with other organizations, but that's not something that we do directly.
Thank you both for your thoughtful responses. I am going to go with another question from the audience. How do children react to housing insecurity? How does housing insecurity affect children and their behaviors? How does intervention and care help?
I can speak to that just a little bit. I was taking care of folks at St. Sylvester's Family Shelter, kind of in Palmer Square, Logan Square, Humboldt Park area for 12 years, and these were families. So it was usually women with their kids, or the husband and wife and their kids. And we often saw regression in development of the kids. There is quite a bit of evidence that even 6 months of experiencing homelessness will cause developmental regression in kids. I often saw children who were 6 or 7 years old start to wet the bed again because of the stress of homelessness. We often saw, certain behaviors that the parents never saw previously, that were kind of acting out type of behaviors, which were made worse because it was difficult within a shelter with lots of other families to try to deal with that type of behavior. It was also difficult because other kids would be acting out and would influence other kids within the same social space. So, unfortunately, there is a lot of developmental regression, but there is hope. I think that, with appropriate guidance, with appropriate social support, with appropriate school support, I think kids are resilient and they can do better. But yes, it really, I'm sure our Dr. Cheng Jonas can speak to a lot more in terms of education, but that's what I saw from the medical side.
Yeah, I just agree with everything that Dr. Huggett said, and I really trust his expertise in terms of seeing pediatric versus adult medicine. But just to piggyback off of that, I do say that you could ask the same question about children in poverty. And as someone, as a second generation Korean immigrant, I just want to say that I was super poor as a child, and I just didn't know it. And then there are other of my friends who are second generation immigrants, and they were poor and they just knew it every day. And you just can't always quantify those reasons why someone is homeless and they just suffer as a child, and when somebody is poor and they suffer as a child, and when they don't. Of course, there's lots of sociological variables in that, but I do say that what he said about children being overall really resilient, I love to say that they're resilient until they're not, right? The default is resilience, but then you see a child where it was just too much, and what they're calling it as a Dr. Huggett, you'll have to correct me if I'm speaking wrongly about this, but the brain's allostatic load of the amount of pressure and amount of stress, whether it's too much academics, too many stressors, homelessness plus this, plus your mom is mentally ill, plus your dad is struggling with work and is an alcoholic, all that allostatic stress on your brain, children are resilient until they're not. So I do think that COVID plus plus for me, George Floyd, plus for me, you know, like I could list like the 5 layers that for me, if there was one more layer, I felt like I would have cracked, right? And I think that that's the same as for children. I will say that, you know, with my family being poor growing up, that they just protected me from a lot of it. And my sister and I just didn't know. And I think that there are some homeless children who like literally don't know anything else, and then they're protected from it because for some reason their home is still safe, they're still very connected to their parents and to their teachers and to their community, but others aren't, and that really is a case by case basis. But there are stories of shocking resilience where students barely seem homeless because they just seem completely normal and like the next kid, and that's beautiful.
That's awesome. Thank you. So our next question is from an audience member, and actually from someone who's going to be speaking tonight. Thank you for your work on behalf of my chosen family. I have a question about the relation between mental illness and homelessness. As we learned yesterday, the vast majority of people who have mental illness symptoms are not homeless. Most people who are homeless do not have mental illness symptoms. We also know that correlation is not causation. So do you think mental illness causes homelessness, or does homelessness cause mental illness? And if we had more time, I would be interested in how you determine that people have serious mental illness.
Well, thanks for that question. I hope that you'll allow me to use your name, Fred. But Fred, one of my favorite people. I think, you know, I have to say, Fred Friedman has been a wonderful participant in the group that's called Charge. So it's Chicago Health and a Homelessness Group for Equity. So he's been great on that group, and I've learned a lot from him. I can say you're absolutely right that there are plenty of folks that are suffering or who are dealing with or living with mental illness that are certainly successfully housed. The estimate in terms of the number of people experiencing homelessness that are living with mental illness is probably about a third. As we heard last night, it probably affects women. Women experiencing homelessness probably are disproportionately affected with living with mental illness than men. And I think to answer your question, I think part of the issue in terms of homelessness and folks living with mental illness has to do with a couple of things from my view, but I would love to hear what you have to say about this tonight, Fred. One is the stigma of living with mental illness. Sometimes landlords don't want to rent to folks who are living with mental illness. Sometimes people living with mental illness may need some extra different types of supports, such as the ACT or CST or RST or all those those initial acronyms, which are basically just kind of supporting folks with who are living with mental illness to get to the goals that they want to get to. And those supports are not funded well enough. Many, many, many more people need those supports. Brianne and Lauren know this by the people that they're working with. We need a lot more support for folks who are living with mental illness so they can achieve what they want to in terms of their housing situation. And that lack of support and that lack of funding and that lack of attention to this issue really is really what drives a lot of folks experiencing homelessness, and they can't find the proper living situation that they really want.
I would also add that, you know, the experience of homelessness and the things that led up to experiencing homelessness, whether it be like on the streets, you know, violence, or, you know, just all the pieces of that are traumatic. And so sometimes we see a trauma response and think that's like a correlation or causation of homelessness, where it's, you know, not necessarily something we need to pathologize and say they have PTSD, but people's response to trauma often can come out looking like a response to or like a symptom of mental illness as well.
Yeah, Brianne, I'm really glad that you said that, because it's not just one trauma. It's kind of the recurrence trauma. So I see folks who, who perhaps had a trauma in their childhood, but they relive that trauma or it's exacerbated if they hear about another death in their family or another shooting, or even vicariously with the murder of George Floyd, as we've brought up, and the shooting of Adam Toledo and so many other shootings. It just brings it up again and again and again. It's like, when is this going to stop? It's really exhausting. It's really exhausting for a lot of folks, and that trauma continues, unfortunately. And that's why folks who are experiencing that continued trauma hopefully will, we need to make sure that they get the supports that they need to work through that trauma to get it to a better place.
That's really good. Thank you. The next question actually kind of flows off of the last bit of your response, Dr. Huggett, but correlation between systemic racism and homelessness.
I feel like we can talk about this all day.
Yeah.
I know we don't have all that much
Conference.
time. Yeah, an entire conference. But just thinking about like history of housing in Chicago and of like, the redlining history and people being pushed out of neighborhoods and being pushed out of affordability, there is that direct correlation. There are things about how our neighborhoods were built and our, how boundary lines were set up and access to purchasing a house that are all come from systemic racism. Oh, I know I won't go further in depth right now.
I like to piggyback on that redlining. Redlining is continuing, as we know. It's just in a different form. There are folks who will not accept, depending on what kind of source of income that is. There are some folks who do not accept that voucher. I had a patient who was at the Shielding Hotel, who had a Cook County voucher for $1,100. He found a place in Berwyn that was for $875. Clearly, his voucher clearly covered it, and he was denied that. And the reason was because of his credit score. But I think we probably really know the reason. It was because of racism. And this kind of veiled redlining or veiled excuse for excluding people because of either source of income or a credit score, even though they have a voucher that will pay fully for that rent. This needs to stop. And we need to move forward. So I think that the housing issue that Brianne brought up, the continued, the redlining problem and the continuing problem with not having enough affordable housing, along with the voucher problem, the specific source of income, that's systemic racism. That's the definition of systemic racism. And there are lots of other examples.
Yeah, and I think just like Mr. Friedman's question about mental illness and homelessness and the correlation, and then the correlation between systemic racism and homelessness, I think that that's the right word. It's correlation, and it's not causation, and it's not like one directionality or the other, but there is kind of a strong correlation between both. And I think in particular, I'm grateful that Dr. Huggett mentioned Toledo. I feel very connected because he rode the same bus line that I ride to work, because my school is in his home area, and then he would ride actually across the only like 3 miles, but still probably like a 40-minute bus ride because of all the stops across the Stevenson. So there's a lot of complications in terms of race and class in America, so much that like in terms of patriotism, I feel like mine declines the longer that I'm working with the poor and working in K-12, because it just gets so much more complicated in America. And yeah, I'm holding on to like really just the great parts of America that I can, but I do feel like systemic racism and homelessness is a huge deal in America, and it's uniquely not only, but it's uniquely strong correlation in America, and other countries struggle with that correlation too, but we have our particular issues with it. And then I just really feel like in terms of the the numbers, if we pulled up the numbers of homelessness with Black and Brown families, um, the correlation is tied with poverty, the correlation is tied with mental illness, the correlation is tied with all these other things, but it's very, very strongly correlated with race. So it just grieves me, and there's so many layers to unpack, and there's a lot of work to be done, and that's why we're all here. But the correlation is definitely strong.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and as you said, there's um, so much that can be talked about on that issue, and just
Could I just say one more thing that certainly affects, especially men experiencing homelessness, that Bobby Watts brought up last night was, the criminal justice system. And, once you're coming out and once you have a record, there are certain places that you cannot live. And so, even if there are certain jobs, you cannot obtain. So, even if a person has actually completed their sentence continues. They're still being penalized, even though they have completed their sentence and have supposedly re-entered community. So that is one thing. I know Lauren works with that a lot in trying to help people achieve housing. And a major barrier is the record that a person may carry from the criminal justice system.
And just really quickly, I would say to all Chicago, the continuum of care, they're doing great work with trying to create like a landlord resource for people who are willing to work with a population of people that we work with. Because landlords won't flat out say, "Oh, I'm denying you because of your background," of course. But they find ways. They say it's a credit score when a credit score may not matter because I have a voucher that's going to pay you directly every month. And so they're definitely, we're seeing redlining in modern day times. And then the history, of just racism throughout the country, unfortunately, it follows us. And the work to dismantle the systems, it's a great work and it's a difficult work. And it's something that we've been fighting for a very long time. And then, our neighborhoods that are historically neighborhoods of color, within the city, people, like someone mentioned, they're being pushed out. So think like in East Garfield Park. East Garfield Park is technically a food desert. So there's technically not a grocery store in East Garfield Park. The average home right now for sale in East Garfield Park is over $300,000. And so when you think about a neighborhood not having a grocery store, but the average home, the base price of a home is $300,000, it kind of puts things in perspective. And so of course, the people who are buying the homes, they have vehicles, they can definitely drive to the closest grocery store, but it just kind of helps you see what we're dealing with within our urban communities in the city. And then the vouchers, people in the suburbs are taking vouchers with no problems. I have families who were able to get single family homes in the suburbs, but the problem is they get in the suburbs and now they have no transportation. They have no way to get around. And so they're isolated and they're stuck, which leads us back to the conversation of mental health, because isolation is not good for anyone. And so it's definitely a very multi-layered conversation that, like you all said, this conference today, we definitely wouldn't even be able to scratch the surface. But it's definitely a conversation that needs to be had.
And if I can piggyback on something that you said, Lauren, just in terms of what people are saying versus what they're thinking and what they're allowed to legally say. A similar situation would be, if I could make the analogy, let's say that someone is interviewing me, who is the age of a mother, who's small and Asian and female. And then they're interviewing younger white male, um, whatever, dot, 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 for an assistant principal position, right? I think that what's so ironic is that they cannot legally say to me, you have kids, you have other responsibilities outside of the 60-hour-a-week job. You surely cannot do this job. You can't say that legally. As soon as you say that, you can get sued. But they could be thinking that inside. They can definitely think, oh, she can't even pull off a suspension of an urban Black kid who's in 8th grade and bigger than her, who has an ankle bracelet. She can't pull that off. They're thinking all these things, and then what they're saying out loud is like, oh, you do not meet the qualifications. Oh, you do not, dot, dot, dot. And I think that that happens all the time, whether it's in the workplace or whether it's in housing vouchers or whether it's in real estate or all those things. So we do make all these judgment calls internally, and then we're legally allowed to say certain things, but not legally allowed to say other things. So I do think that happens all the time. And what you said happens all the time. And then it's in multiple ways. And that's why it's systemic racism and not just only about housing or only about employment. It is systemic.
Thank you all for all of those wonderful thoughts. And yeah, honestly, that might be the topic for the next conference we do, because that is so, has so many layers and is so deep. So I just want to recognize the time for a second. It's 11:26. We're wrapping up in the next 4 minutes. So I think we'll do one last question before we sign off. And this question I say for the audience and for everyone who might be watching in the recording as well. What are some practical things people can do to get involved?
So I'll speak directly from Breakthrough. Right now, it's difficult for us to bring in volunteers right now. Like, just honestly, because of COVID, because of the population of people that we serve, sometimes we have people who have a higher predisposition to contracting COVID just because of their underlying conditions. And so we're trying to be very cautious about the ways in which we engage volunteers. What we need right now is mask, PPE. We're taking cleaning supplies, all that kind of thing. So that's one way, is to just donate those kinds of things to the shelter so that we can make sure we're keeping our facilities clean and safe. Because Breakthrough is 24 hours, 7 days a week, we serve 3 meals a day. We're always looking for meals. So there are a few ways that we're asking people to assist us with that. Normally, we would have you into our facility, open up our kitchen, allow you to cook with your family and friends and eat dinner with our guests. But right now, that's not possible. We're hoping to bring that back relatively soon. However, with this uptick that we are kind of seeing in the city right now, we're being a little cautious, but you can donate a meal. We have some restaurants in our area that we know will deliver to us. And so, you can get in touch with myself and I can put you in contact with the appropriate person to get a meal donated to feed the men and women that we serve. And then we accept donations of clothing, and new and used underwear and socks are the big need right now. We could definitely use underwear and socks. I probably can speak for Brianne for that as well. That's always a big need in shelter systems. And so, just trying to be creative in the ways in which you give. I know a lot of times we find value in being amongst people and being able to be in facilities and talk to people and work with people. But I know at Breakthrough, we're just asking people to be mindful and, consider that we're trying to make sure people stay safe. And so, that's really the ways right now. We do have an upcoming volunteer night. It's this Monday, the 19th, I think is Monday's date, at 5 p.m. And so I can get that information to James, and James, maybe you can share it with the participants if they'd like to join to find out more. And that'll give you more in-depth detail about who Breakthrough is as well.
Yeah, I can definitely do that. Thank you. Any other comments or thoughts on ways that people can get involved in the last minute or so?
I can say just really briefly, I see the question, how do you help folks who are homeless and are living with mental illness and can't afford to seek out help themselves? That is really a tough question, but there are street outreach people that go out with Thresholds, Trilogy, HRDI, Haas. So there are groups that do street outreach. So I would reach out to even call 311 if you notice somebody regularly who may need some outreach, to have somebody try to start the engagement process of starting a conversation. And I think the other thing that I've come to do is, when I'm downtown, or if I'm going to be on the streets or taking the L, or, anticipate that somebody may be asking me for change or something, is I put a dollar bill in my pocket. I take it out of my wallet and put it in my pocket so I'm ready. That way I don't have to mess around with my wallet or anything like that. And the other thing I found to be really important is to look the person in the eye and say something to them, and say, stay safe, or stay well, or, hope things, whatever, say something that, say something and acknowledge their humanness. And I think that can really go a long way to making all of us be brothers and sisters.
That's really good. Thank you. Yeah. And with that, if it's all right, I might send, I think there's one last question we didn't get answered. I'll send that to the panelists separately, and if y'all have answers you want to contribute, then we can send that out later in email to the attendees. Thank you all so much for your time. I really appreciate it. We'll be meeting back up again tonight from 7 to 8 p.m. And we'll be hearing from Fred and as well as Edrika. So thank you so much for your time. I hope you have a great rest of your day.